Howdy, Chess College. How's it going? It is May 6th already. We got this week, next week. It's it, folks. So we're winding down the course. I've assigned everything. You've got one more essay to do on rock and roll or music or hip hop or pop music or jazz, blues, anything from that list I provided. There's a research paper about any topic. I provided the topics. And then there's your journal. Get everything in. You see the due dates. I haven't posted the journal. I'm going to do that tonight when you can hand it in, which is essentially any between now and then the class. Um, so anyway, hope everything's going okay out there. Um, I'm going to go look at your conversations. Hopefully somebody's participating. If not, you'll be losing points. Um, right now, I'm going to flash forward to rock and roll, the beginnings of rock and roll, which really had the beginnings in rhythm and blues. That's what they used to call it, and rhythm and roll, and so it's part blues, got some folk music in there, and then it was kind of snapped up, and then with the invention of the electric guitar, which was really vital to the rock and roll scene. Um, you could you tribute um, Leo Fender, who did the Fender guitar, and forgetting his name, we did the Les Paul. Oh, Les Paul, that's right. Did the Les Paul, a Gibson guitar. He wasn't Mr. Gibson, but he designed for them that, and they produced it, and it changed the history of music. And early practitioners of the Fender guitar was mostly Buddy Holly and um, Elvis didn't really use Fender, but a lot of bands started using these instruments to amplify their sound, get things going more. Gretsch Guitar Country Gentleman was a big electric guitar favorite of rock and rollers of the 50s. Um, a great rock and roller just died this week, actually, at 87. Dwayne Eddy, he had produced, he was instrumentalist, mostly played a Gretsch Country Gentleman, died at 87. He really is almost the inventor of what we might consider electric rock and roll guitar. He had a couple big hits with Rebel Rouser was one of them. Go look at it on YouTube. Maybe I'll post it. Um, it's instrumental. He didn't sing. He wasn't a singer, but he was changed the guitar. People like Jimmy Page, Jeff Beck, he was their hero. He was doing things with electric guitar we'd never heard before. This is long before all the electronics we have now were developed. They weren't invented then. There was no fancy foot pedals or push a button and this happens. That all had to be done old school. And guys like him created a sound that young market, the youth market really took to. The older generation thought it was noise, thought it was irritable, and so they were kind of left out. That would be my parents' generation. They loved big band music. They loved Frank Sinatra and Harry Belafonte, and I love all them too. But it wasn't rock and roll. And rock and roll hit in the 50s with Chuck Berry, Little Richard, Elvis Presley, Everly Brothers, Buddy Holly. It hit like a freight train. Jerry Lee Lewis. These are icons of the 1950s. They invented everything music from the Beatles to the Stones to Pearl Jam, all stand on the shoulders of these guys. Without these guys, there would be no Nirvana. There'd be no Sex Pistols, nothing. These folks in the 50s, very conservative time in America, we're in a Cold War with Soviet Union. We've got nuclear threat from Soviet Union. We've got the House on Un-American Activities happening in the Congress. Everybody's suspected of being a communist. People are losing their jobs. Hollywood was under the microscope for being a communist hotbed of activity. And so things were hopping in the 50s. Then we had the conservative TV, like Leave It to Beaver, Father Knows Best, on a Reed show. That's what we were living on. And then some of our greatest hours of our lifetimes, anybody's lifetime. Jackson Pollock and Willem de Kooning and Randy Warhol thrived in the 50s. Jazz, like Miles Davis and John Coltrane, were thriving in the 50s. They were pushing the envelope on what they could do with jazz, atonal jazz, bebop. Uh, artists always push back against conservative times with innovation and things that disrupt the status quo. And rock and roll, let me tell you, disrupted the status quo. In the early days, it was considered race music, meaning black music from the South, but then white people started practicing it, and like Jerry Lee Lewis and Elvis Presley, and they made a lot of songs written by black artists famous. Uh, Pat Boone, one of the most boring, smooth artists who ever lived, white artist, made Little Richard's songs famous by him singing 'em. When Little Richard sang them, they were too raw, they were too sexual, they were too overt, but when Pat sang them, it was all safe as mother's milk, and, people bought those records in droves, not Little Richard's songs, Pat Boone. So Pat Boone and Elvis made a lot of black music famous by putting a rock and roll beat to it that was susceptible, I hate to say it, by radio audiences that were predominantly white. Um, and that's hugely popular in the 50s. These bands, they were not what they called poets yet. That becomes a thing of the 60s when Bob Dylan started writing intricate lyrics that we never heard before. Before Bob Dylan, it was all about a guy meeting a girl and hoping to get with the girl and having a good time driving your car around. The lyrics are pretty simplistic but for meaningful for the youth market because that's what they wanted to do. They wanted to go drive around the convertible, smoke cigarettes, drink a little cheap beer, and make out in the back seat. Of course, this is conservative times. You may not be back there with the same sex member because you could have been arrested. The times are tough if you happen to be a member of the community, the queer community, and which covers a lot of people now. So that has changed, but this is long before that changed. So then we come into the 60s and we got kind of smooth rock and roll, safe rock and roll, uh, Frankie Avalon and oh, so many of them who made safe rock and roll, and it was kind of boring but safe. And TV shows like American Bandstand start popping up, playing this music, and people were tuning into it. Kids, the youth market, to watch people dance to this sort of music. Um, that all changed in 1963 about when we heard about this band called the Beatles in this country. This is before, long before social media, long before the internet. So you had to read about it in an actual newspaper. We heard about this band called the Beatles. What a strange name, named after a bug. Well, they named it because Buddy Holly's band were called the Crickets, and that was their take on the Crickets. But they're not spelled Beatles like with two E's. They're spelled beat, like in rock and roll beat, 4/4 beat, and that was the clever spelling of the Beatles. And it says so much about the Beatles, their lyrics, their humor, their presentation. Um, and when they played Ed Sullivan in January '64, it changed everything. At the time, yes, I was 12 years old. That's how old I am. Deal with it. Um, we all tuned to our TV sets. My parents, my cousins came over to our house because they didn't have they didn't have a good TV, and we all saw this phenomenon. Ed Sullivan was a weekly variety show that we all lived by on Sundays nights. Usually it was at 8 o'clock, and because at 9 o'clock we had to go to bed, folks. Parents were strict in those days. Anyway, And then all of a sudden, we'd heard about this thing happening, and then we saw it on TV, and it changed all of our worlds. We never seen anything like it. We never seen people play their instruments like that, sing like that. "I wanna hold your hand, please, please me, help." Um, we never seen long hair like that. If you look at it now, it looks pretty short, but they dressed in nice suits and behaved themselves, and so even the parents kinda liked it, and that was a clever marketing thing by their manager, Brian Epstein. He he said, "Boys, we gotta make yourself presentable." And the scruffy '50s look with the greased back pompadour hairs and black leather jacket was turning the parents off. And we wanted the parents to like you. Well, the parents did like the Beatles. The parents did not like the Rolling Stones, who didn't do what Brian Epstein wanted. They went the opposite. They dressed like regular people, and their hair was scruffy but not perfect like the Beatles were. And they didn't smile through their bluesy sort of songs, and they had a different thing, and the girls loved it. Both bands were inundated with millions of girls screaming at their concerts. Hard to believe, but people are screaming at Taylor Swift now, so you know what it is. Um, and so the Beatles changed everything. When the Beatles played Ed Sullivan, bands in LA formed because of that show. The Byrds, Love, The Doors, famous bands. Jefferson Airplane saw the Beatles. We want to do that. Um, the Velvet Underground in New York. We saw the Beatles. We want to do that. Everybody was influenced by that performance. What's an electric guitar? Where do we buy an electric guitar? And in those days, they weren't everywhere like they are now. It was hard to find one. And so it became a phenomenon. The boys wanted to have the guitars, and the girls wanted to hang out with the boys with the guitars. And the rest, as they say, is history. You're probably sick of bands like the Beatles and the Rolling Stone. Well, that's what started it all. And if you don't know your history, you won't ever appreciate it. There's no room for a band. Well, do you have a favorite band? Do you even listen to music, or is it all? I don't know what you listen to. Is it hip hop? Is it electronica? There's a ton of stuff out there. I listen to a lot of it. I still listen to it. I just downloaded this week I went on a road trip and listened to The Kills. I dare you to listen to their new album. Listen to it. Slater Kinney. Listen to it. And I'm old, guys, and I'm open to new ideas because I'm always looking for something new. And there's a couple bands that are pushing the envelope that possibly you've never heard of. Anyway, music is a lifeblood for my generation that I've never gotten over. And then after the Beatles came out and the Rolling Stones, then there was what they call the British first wave with bands like the Animals and the Zombies and the Kinks. The Kinks above all. Kinks might be my favorite all-time band of all time. Um, all coming out of war-torn England. They were recovering from World War II. They'd been bombed, remember. We've never been bombed here except for the World Trade Center. We've never been bombed in this country, so we've always kind of been safe that way, but they weren't safe in England. Hitler bombed London nightly until we got into the war and the bombing stopped because we went to war with Germany. Um, and then World War II was on in full glory. So that's where these band people like Paul McCartney and John Lennon were children playing in the rubble of the burnt out buildings in Manchester, Liverpool, and London, of course. And they had to find a new way to express themselves. And they heard rhythm and blues coming out of America on radio, the radio coming from America. They heard Chuck Berry and Little Richard and um, Fats Domino and Elvis, of course, Jerry Lee Lewis, the Everly Brothers, Buddy Holly, and they never heard anything like that. They wanted to replicate that. And so a young Paul McCartney gets his first guitar at 12. John Lennon forms his first band, the Quarrymen, at 13. Uh, Paul joins it, and they're playing cheap guitars that their parents couldn't even afford to get them because these were financial hardships on everybody. But their kids had talent and a drive, and the rest is history. When there's a way and a motive, these things happen. That's how Nirvana started. Kurt and his friends were home. They were poor, living in Aberdeen, Washington. They didn't know what to do with their time. They're smoking cigarettes and smoking pot underneath the bridge, wondering what they're going to do with their lives until they discovered the guitar. And guess what? Kurt Cobain wrote some of the greatest songs ever. The last great generation of rock and roll songwriters, the grunge era, which I'll talk about later, not today. Um, it all started with these 50s bands and then the 60s. And then by the time the middle 60s came, bands like The Who, what they call the second wave of British bands, were coming up. Cream was changing the whole landscape. Cream with Eric Clapton, Jack Bruce, Ginger Baker was a power trio, a bluesy, borderline heavy rock. They didn't call it heavy metal in those days, but it was definitely heavy rock. Big stacks of Marshall amps, lots of jams on the electric guitar, electric bass, and beautiful songs. And then somebody like Jimi Hendrix was in England at the time. He's an American. He'd been touring the world with other bands, and he decided to stay in London and try to make a career of himself. And he started hanging out at these clubs and playing up on stage in bands. People like Jeff Beck from the Yardbirds and Eric Clapton from Cream saw him, and they said the face of music changed when Jimi Hendrix got on stage. Nobody had heard the electric guitar like that before, and he had to do it old school, not with a bunch of effect pedals, because they didn't have that stuff then. He had to come up with his own way to make the guitar sound like a living thing, and he did. And then, and he was a black man in a white culture, but he was accepted. And then the whole flower power thing hit big time in the late 60s, and Jimi Hendrix was at the forefront of that music, which would be almost what they would call psychedelic music. The bands like Pink Floyd were coming along, um, Moody Blues, so many others were playing intricate rock and roll with this new electronical sound because they were getting instruments that had um, sounds they could never make before because these are new instruments. They can make sounds with keyboards that we could never make before in the history of music, and bands like Moody Blues were using that. Um, anyway, I'm not going to go too much further because I don't want to bore you guys with my passion for rock and roll. But I still look for new music. Tonight I was driving my car around listening to Coney Island Baby by Lou Reed. Maybe you've heard of Lou Reed. He had a little band called the Velvet Underground, and we'll talk about that later when I get into art music of the 60s and 70s. That's coming up next. Good luck with your papers. Explore these avenues, open your ears, and discover new things. There's a great world of music out there. Talk to you later.